Well, I'll hand over to Alan Stuart, who needs no introduction, I think, but I'll give him a little bit of one anyway. But I mean, Alan's been and done it all in terms of the club. He's a life member, and so he's well known to many of you, and he's about to I think share with us some of the fruits of the labour that the Hunter Estuary surveys have gone into producing data for. So thank you, Alan.
Thanks very much, Dan. I was going to start by asking, does anyone know why it's time to celebrate? But we've already had the cake, so I think we know that. So,
if it's not working, you probably have to click on it. Now it probably will activate it. And not found out how to get rid of it, and just normally end up moving it either to the top or bottom, wherever's least annoying. But hopefully it's that way.
okay, so everyone that's here at the meeting knows that we've just completed 23 years of monthly surveys of the Hunter Estuary. Those of you watching from home won't have known that, and you will have missed out on the wonderful cake that Dan brought in. Thanks very much for organising that, Dan. So 23 years is not a particularly milestone event. So I'm certainly looking forward to what will happen in 2 years' time when we hit a proper milestone. But we used to have a cake every anniversary. You'll see a photo, a few slides' time of one such example. Exactly 1 year ago, Ange and I were talking with 22 years of surveys had just ticked over, and we were saying, no one's ever really looked seriously at what data we've collected and tried to work and make any sense out of it. So we decided to have a go, and tonight is really the story of the 22 years of Hunter Estuary surveys. So I haven't included the most recent 12 months in this, but you can expect that it's pretty much the story continuing. So I was going to call the talk "It's Time to Celebrate," but I realised that wasn't a very meaningful title. So I changed it instead to "How Good is the Hunter Estuary?" This is channeling Scott Morrison a bit in terms of his approach. And basically, the Hunter Estuary is pretty good, I suppose. How the story is going to end up when you've heard it all. There's not all good news, but there's a lot of good news in amongst it all. So this is the title as was advertised. However, today I realised that Scott Morrison doesn't actually pose it as a question; he poses it as an affirmation. So now we have yet another title for the talk. And so it's "How Good's the Hunter Estuary?" And the main theme will be about there's been habitat changes, what birds have done well and what birds have not done so well out of all those changes. So I've got some 3 slides to start with, which are really just background about various things. First of all, about surveying in the estuary. So from the 1960s, there has been intermittent campaigns of people doing surveys. Glenn Holmes in the 60s, Tom Kendall and Fred Van Gestel. I think I saw Tom's face on screen at home, and others. AWSG for a little while have done some effort, but then it's all petered out. In 1999, we decided to have a serious go and to try and get monthly surveys happening, and we managed to continue doing that for now what is 23 years. In the beginning, there were only 4 of us, and we covered a lot of the estuary just between the 4 of us, but pretty quickly others got involved when they could see that this was a good thing to be doing. And we no longer actually even try and track how many people have been involved with the surveys, although Anne probably could dig that out. But we know that it's well over 200 people now that have helped at least one survey. Many have done lots of them, several years since. And Anne and I are still soldiering on as the originals. In the surveys, all waterbirds and shorebirds are monitored, and in 23 years, there's been 98 species of shorebird and waterbird recorded in the surveys. However, we do have to always recognise that the starting point and still the main focus of the surveys has been about shorebirds. So we do the surveys at high tide, which is when shorebirds are roosting, and we have teams going out simultaneously to visit lots of sites, but they are sites that are known to host shorebirds or that potentially could host shorebirds. Right? So I guess we're not covering every spot in the lower Hunter that has waterbirds. But nevertheless, we're covering a lot of things, and it's a massive database, 98 species, 23 years worth of results. So it gives us a chance to look at all sorts of things in terms of things like seasonal variations, longer term trends, and what some of the changes in habitat have led to. Here's a photo of the team in 2006 at the 7th anniversary. Back in those days, we used to meet under the Stockton Bridge, and every anniversary we'd have a cake. So this was a cake provided by, I think I provided the cake, but I don't know who took that photo. It was not one of us that's in the photos. Was it Mick? Was it? Okay. You did cross my mind, but obviously didn't know how to do that time control thing back in those days. Okay, so the estuary has had lots of changes, and the next two slides just summarise some of the negatives and some of the positives that have happened over a long period of time. I'm talking about more than just the period that the surveys have taken place. So negatives, throughout the 20th century, it was just relentless losses of habitat, losses of wetlands, losses of shoreline, through all sorts of reasons, dredging, amalgamation of islands to make what is now Kooragang Island, one big island. It used to be lots of small ones. Flood control gates put in, all sorts of things leading to loss of habitat, creation of freshwater wetlands rather than tidal ones, that kind of thing. Another very big negative, and one which we didn't really know about until relatively recently, was about what's happening in Thornton Cove with contamination by firefighting chemicals from the airport. So we read in the media a lot about the poor people who are living in those places, but it's also affected the habitat for the wildlife up there too, and I'll have more to say about that. Another negative was the sewage works at Stockton closed. It kind of had to go because it was a really primitive technology, but it was a pretty major roost site, had a big impact. There was an oil spill which had an impact, and we should never lose sight of one of the main parts of Ash Island, the area E ponds, Swan Pond, Wader Pond, all those areas are actually reserved for an infrastructure corridor. Was going to be a steelworks, there's going to be an airport. Nevertheless, it's reserved for something. As soon as we stop paying attention, they'll try and take it away from us. Okay, some positives as well. The first two of these happened by accident, or at least they didn't have an intention to do something good for birds. Stockton sand spit got created. That actually was when they were dredging to build Stockton Bridge. That dredge spoil got sort of spread out and became Stockton sand spit. You can see on that inset photo, a photo from an image from about 1970. The bridge is still only partly built, and just look at all the birds that are already hanging around at that time. So that happened, and also the Kooragang dikes were constructed. The intention for those dikes was to isolate the river from the land to put factories on the land behind the dikes. But thankfully that didn't happen. The dikes were turned into a major shorebird roost site, and we all know that's Stockton sand spit and its importance for shorebirds as well. So two very, very positive things for birds. Also very positive has been from about 2000 when projects first started, tidal flushing reinstated at Ash Island first, and then at Hexham Swamp some time ago. And that's had the effect of creating, in fact, recreating, because it used to be there, more than 1,500 hectares of tidal wetlands. So that's all happened in the time that we've been doing these surveys. Some other good things, we should never lose sight of the fact that most of the important parts of the estuary have their conservation values are formally recognised. So it started off with Kooragang Nature Reserve. That's now been expanded to the Hunter Wetlands National Park. It doesn't cover all the spots that are important for birds and shorebirds in particular, but it covers a lot of them, and it's great that that's protected. And another very positive thing, certainly it's hard to, if you're looking back 20 or so years ago, hard to imagine that we would have got to this stage because it was so difficult dealing with mangroves 20 or so years ago. But there's now a general acceptance that the targeted control of mangroves is an important thing to do for the benefit of shorebirds, and that's been a really great thing. Okay, so what I'm going to go through tonight is a lot of trends for various guilds of birds, shorebirds, terns, waterbirds in general. And so you'll see results for all that. We talked about migratory shorebirds and why their numbers are plummeting. We'll talk about the decline in silver gulls. Came as a big surprise to find that silver gulls in decline. The black-necked stork is a really big success story. We'll hear about that. And part of the theme of the talk really is about the benefits for birds from all these rehabilitation projects that have happened. All right, so let's start with shorebirds and with endemic shorebirds first of all. So in general, what we found for endemic shorebirds is that their numbers are stable or they're rising. You can find any examples of endemic shorebirds in decline. Two big winners have been the pied stilt and masked lapwing, and these two graphs here, these two graphs, firstly the masked lapwing and then the pied stilt, slightly higher one on the right, divide the data up into three approximately equal periods, so 7 years, 7 years and 8 years of data, and we're looking at the spread of counts. So every month there's a count, and those boxes show the spread. Basically, it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's enough now. So with lapwings, you can see they didn't change much in between the first and second periods, but in the third period, their numbers have rocketed up. With pied stilt, actually numbers went down a bit in the second of the three periods, but then they have jumped up considerably. What's happened here, be careful with this screen that's jumping. With the stilts, what actually is the effect here is that we had birds here in the first 7 years. The millennium drought broke. There was good rainfall inland. A lot of birds left the estuary and went inland. But then in the final period, we've had the new wetlands come on stream, we've had another drought, and we see the numbers of pied stilt just skyrocket. So the stilt and lapwing have been the big winners. We've also seen for black-fronted dotterel and red-kneed dotterel increases in their winter numbers. So there's a lot more of them present in winter than summer. So they've also benefited from the new wetlands that have been created. But their numbers are a lot more variable because they're much more strongly linked with inland rainfall patterns. So they come and go. For avocets, particularly need to mention, so the Hunter Estuary is an absolutely amazing spot for avocets. The estimated total population of avocets is 100,000 birds. Whenever you've got more than 1% of the population present somewhere, that's considered to be important. We very regularly have at least 5,000 avocets in the estuary. Sometimes there are 7,000 or 8,000 birds. Huge numbers of them in terms of their total population. But the numbers fluctuate very dramatically in response to inland rainfall patterns. And in this graph, you can see, so it's basically the graph shows the monthly counts, but the big red arrows show periods, which are quite lengthy periods, of the order of a year to 2 years, when avocets were essentially absent from the estuary. And we're actually going through, we're still in the middle of the fourth of these ones here now, this one over here. I think the last month's avocet count was 4 birds. So they're still not back because it's good rain inland. From some other analysis that I had done a couple of years ago, it takes 3 months of above average rainfall inland before our avocets disappear. They disappear because when they've got all that good rain inland, they go to breed and they don't come back again until they've bred and the wetlands inland have started to dry up enough to bring them to come back. So they'll stay, you know, if it still keeps raining inland, they'll stay and they'll keep breeding. The story for migratory shorebirds is nowhere near a good story to tell. For most species, with 3 exceptions, the sharp-tailed sandpiper, Pacific golden plover and grey-tailed tattler, all the other species are showing massive declines. And particularly for birds that were coming here in big numbers, so you know, things that were only coming up in 2s and 3s, which we now hardly ever see, that's a kind of like a subset of the main story. The main story is birds that were here in big numbers are now not here. So again, we're looking at here for bar-tailed godwit and for far eastern curlew. I've divided the data into 3 periods of 7 years, 7 years and 8 years. And you can just see on the spread of counts for eastern curlew, it's just gone down, down, down. Bar-tailed godwit, same sort of thing. Oops. And all of those changes are statistically significant. So they're not just random. Statistical analysis says these are real changes and they're really serious ones. For curlew sandpiper, we've got the data showing in a different way. So basically this is just showing the monthly counts, and there's a trend line fitted here. You can just see the line, it's got a slope of about 7 or 8% downwards per annum. So they're all in serious decline, with the exception of the 3 that I mentioned before. With the grey-tailed tattlers, that's only been a modest change. So there were about 20 in the estuary in the summer count. Now it's gone up to about 30, so that's a change, but it's not a big change. Sharp-tailed sandpipers, that change has been quite dramatic here. It's a bit sudden death with the keyboard, sorry. So we see the sharpies, so the first and second periods, the numbers were pretty much the same. There's some outliers here where occasionally there's an influx of a lot more birds. And then we've got the third period, and the numbers just up very much higher. And the reason for that is because, as it says in the text on the screen there, for 8 years in a row, 7 years, sorry, we had at least 1,000 birds every year in the estuary, and the peak count was about 8,000 birds, about 8% of the total population. In the last, since 2019, so the last 3 years, the numbers have gone back down again, so they're much more back to where they used to be, down around these sort of numbers. The reasons. Well, there's also not so many, but sure, we can't count them, but we're not missing 8,000 birds. So what was happening here, we had inland drought bringing birds to the coast, and we also had the new wetlands, so it's habitat for them. So they came, they liked it, and they stuck around basically. Pacific golden plover. Is there a mouse? So the plover, thanks Mick. Plover have just gone up, up, up. Again, each of these changes is really significant. And so we're now sort of getting counts of 400 or 500 Pacific golden plover in summertime in the estuary. That's a great change. It's actually taken them back to the numbers like what they used to be in the 1980s, right? So still, it's a recovery rather than an improvement, but it's certainly been a definite change, and it is contrary to the trend for southeastern Australia generally, where plovers are going down as a general the general outcome, but in the Hunter, that is not the case. So we've got a situation where some shorebird numbers are increasing and others are decreasing. Why is that? So all the species that are in decline have three things in common. They are migratory, plus the majority of their population goes through the Yellow Sea on the way to the breeding grounds, sometimes on the way back as well. So they've got a fairly high Yellow Sea dependency. Those two factors are what's affecting those shorebirds throughout southeastern Australia. But the other thing that these birds have in common in their estuary is that they mainly forage those birds in Fullerton Cove. But the three species that are not in decline, three migratory species, they mainly don't forage in Fullerton Cove, nor do the endemic shorebirds. So the tattlers, they forage anywhere and they'll go to Fullerton Cove, but they just hang around mangroves anywhere around the estuary, basically. Sharpies are more sort of like the Hexham Swamp, Tomago type wetlands, and Pacific golden plovers are mainly feeding around rock shelves, exposed rock ledges within the river at low tide, not in Fullerton Cove. All the species that are not in decline or which are having their population increase, they're generalist species, and those newly available wetlands have been a great benefit for all those generalist shorebirds. But certainly, Anne and I posed the question that we know that there's contamination in Fullerton Cove from the chemicals, confirmed to be present. They're at levels below what causes acute toxicity for benthic organisms, from where there has been studies, but nobody's done any studies of chronic effects, which is long-term effects. And it is absolutely the case that the declines in the Hunter Estuary are the greatest for any site in Australia, from a study that was done by Rich Fuller and that group of people about 3 or 4 years ago. They had the declines for every site in Australia that's regularly monitored. The Hunter Estuary top all of Australia for its declines. So if it's not Fullerton Cove, then there's some other problem, but it's hard to not look at Fullerton Cove as the cause of the problems. Okay, on to gulls and terns. And first of all, the silver gull. Turns out that they're here higher numbers in summer and autumn. So this graph here has got 2 11-year periods: summer, autumn, winter, and spring counts. You can see the summer and autumn counts are higher than the winter and spring ones. So that's when they tend to be here in the bigger number. But what has also happened, if you look at these results, is there's been quite a considerable decrease. And in fact, the numbers on average have gone to about half what they used to be for silver gulls. That change happened from about 2010, so it's pretty clear, roughly through the arbitrary border where we put our two sets of data. That's about when the decline started. We tried to investigate that. We had a few theories. They all came unstuck, but the one that we now think is the explanation is that's about when, at Summer Hill, they started to change some of their management practices out there, including they now cover the heaps at night time and the ones that aren't in use. So there's a lot less foraging opportunities than there used to be for silver gulls. So silver gulls are not threatened or anything. There's still lots of them around, but the numbers have about halved, which is quite interesting to discover. On terns, it's a mixed story. So we've got some terns with increasing populations, the Galville tern, Caspian tern and whiskered tern all going up. White-winged black tern and common tern going down. Crested tern and little tern currently stable. So little terns used to be here in much bigger numbers in the 70s and 80s, sort of like 500 or so at times. We don't see anything like those numbers, but the declines have been arrested, so they're in a stable situation now. Explaining all this, so we think that the birds with the decreasing populations, that's to do with the flyaway. So basically, white-winged black tern and common tern are migratory terns, and I think that things outside of the hunter may well be affecting them. But the ones with increasing populations, that's almost certainly because they're getting the benefit of having these new wetlands available. And, so that's the case for them. For little terns, they probably have benefited excuse me, from the improved management practices on the Warramai lands. A lot more control over vehicle usage than it used to be. When there's a tern colony established, they put fences around it and so forth and try to. So I think the little tern has benefited from those sort of changes. Now, for the story for ducks and waterbirds, initially just look at small waterbirds. Lots of them have got increasing populations, or the populations have increased during the course of the survey. So listed in here, there's about 7 or 8 of them where the numbers have gone up statistically, significant changes in their numbers. Some of them, it's not year round, they have a sort of a season, and we'll talk about seasonality later on. They have a season or a couple of seasons where you're hearing bigger numbers, and that's where the changes occur, but they certainly have benefited. For small waterbirds, ducks and grebes and those sort of things, we couldn't find any evidence for any populations, any species that had decreasing populations. But there are some that have had fluctuating populations, like pink-eared duck, hard-headed shoveler, hoary-headed grebe. So when it's wet inland, they go away and they come back again, but the numbers generally are stable. Same seems to be true of the crakes, but it's a lot harder to understand the crakes because we have such few numbers of them and they're so cryptic, so we don't really get the full picture. So we're seeing from the data from the estuary surveys, we're seeing changes, and we're certainly seeing lots of species having increasing populations. Just want to emphasise the point, though, that we're not looking at all the wetlands in the lower Hunter where these species occur. So it's not a full story when you just look at the Hunter estuary, but nevertheless, it's a story from a systematic survey map. I wanted to talk in particular about chestnut teal. It's a very important species in the Hunter estuary. Not something that gets a lot of coverage, but it is. So I said earlier in the talk that if you ever get 1% or more of a total population in an area, that area is considered to be really important for that species. So we really often get at least 1,000 chestnut teal, which is 100,000 populations, the estimate. We've had, I think, 11 time periods, some of those time periods spanning several months, 11 time periods in 22 years when we've had at least 1,000 chestnut teal in the estuary. And the peak count, about 5 years ago, there was nearly 4,000 birds in the estuary. So really important. And you can see here, there's monthly counts, there's my voice, and lots of counts of over 1,000 birds in that time. Interesting that the greatest numbers of them occur in autumn. And so here's the plot now to summer, first and second 11-year period, autumn, first and second periods, winter and spring. You can see that numbers are much higher in summer and autumn than they are in winter and spring, thanks Mick. And autumn in the second period has had a really significant increase in chestnut teal numbers. And that's a significant, statistically significant increase in the numbers. Now, this is black-necked stork is probably the success story of the hunter and the rehabilitation work that's happened. So, for the first 14 years of surveys, we only had 2 records for black-necked stork in that whole time. There were occasionally birds reported, on other days, so they were around, but there was not many of them, and they were all over the place, hardly ever recorded. What's happened since then is the reporting rate is now up to 39% in that period. So 2 out of every 5 surveys, at least 1 black-necked stork gets recorded. That's a huge change. And there's now 2 breeding pairs. There's a pair of Tomago that's bred at least 3 times, a pair of Hexham which was bred at least twice, and it's probably actually bred 3 or 4 times. We've seen young birds with parents and that sort of thing. Couple of photos here. This is one of the chicks at Tomago, about to fledge. This one over here was the very first chick from Tomago, which after a bit of a up and down life for a year or 2, ended up at Tea Gardens, and it's spent a year or 2 up at Tea Gardens. I don't know whether there's any recent records of it. But anyhow, that's a hunter born and bred stork. And what we're also seeing for black-necked stork is it's not just what's happening locally. So there's now, in this most recent summer, a pair that bred up near Stratford. And on the Central Coast, they're getting records now more regularly of black-necked stork, including this past season, they've had adults with chicks. I think that the success in the hunter has generated a population of storks which is spreading out, and so the whole of New South Wales is benefiting from the benefits that our local birds have got. Looking at other large water birds, again we see lots of species that have had population increases, statistically significant ones. There's a long list here of 7 or 8 species that have done better over the course of the surveys. And we couldn't find any species that we could prove had decreasing populations out of it all. A couple of question marks, but the data don't say that there is a change. Australasian bittern, we know that they lost some habitat. So there used to be some birds at Tomago in freshwater wetlands, which are now salt, and those birds are gone. But the bitterns have also, as salt water is pushed into places like Hexham Swamp, that's created fresh water, over a larger area than it used to be. So they probably haven't lost much habitat if they've lost any. Egrets, the data from the estuary surveys suggest that the numbers are stable. But here at the Wetland Centre, although the populations fluctuate, it does seem to be a long-term trend for downwards. So I guess at the moment we can't rationalise those two different sort of things, but they don't seem to be affected at estuary sites. So just putting all that together, it's a slide that summarises the winners and the losers. The winners, species with increasing populations, are here on the left, and decreasing populations on the right. It's not quite as out of balance as it looks, because I've grouped under the heading all the other migratory shorebirds rather than list them separately, but there's a lot of winners, and the losers are far fewer. And if you take away the migratory shorebirds, then there's not many at all. So seasonality, there was some discussion on hunter birding a couple of weeks back about seasonality, what turns up when. I've just put that together into a few slides. So first of all, for gulls and terns. So the ticks are where the numbers rise in particular seasons. So you can see pretty strong summer, autumn rise for the first 3 species. Whiskered tern is spring, is when we mostly get whiskered terns. Little terns, summer and spring. And common tern, this is different. So it's got a cross in winter. So basically, summer, autumn, and spring, we get common tern records quite regularly, particularly at late spring and early autumn when they're still around. So it's really only winter that we don't have common terns. For waterbirds, much longer list of seasonality. Again, so it's quite dominated by autumn species or summer-autumn species. I won't go through them all, but there's quite a long list. The only species that has a population increase in winter is the black swan, and the only one that has an increase in spring is the great pied cormorant, but that also has a spring and summer increase. And there's two species, shoveler and white-faced heron, which for 3 seasons, the numbers are kind of stable. It's really only in spring where their numbers go down, so they actually leave the estuary. Qualify all this by saying that for 3 species, shoveler, grey teal, and hoary-headed grebe, the pattern is quite complicated, and it does suggest that there's been a change. So from what happened in the early years to what's happening now is different. So it's going to need a bit more careful examination to understand that story fully.
Inland drought.
There's inland drought. There's all those things. So what we've done so far is kind of like a first pass analysis, and I guess it's showing us the things that we need to look more carefully at. So for seasonality, just showing this in two additional slides. So here's all the small waterbirds. So this is the swans, the ducks, the grebes, the crakes. A very clear summer, autumn versus spring, winter difference in their numbers in the estuary, and very clear, much more likely to be here in autumn, in higher numbers in autumn. And this shows it more strongly by breaking it up into 2 11-year periods. So we've got summer, autumn, winter, and spring. And you can see what's really changed in the most recent 11-year period is a lot higher numbers of small waterbirds in the estuary in autumn. Big change. So to wrap up with a couple of things. So the first 3 dot points here are true conclusions. So that restoration of tidal flushing, I think you can see very clearly that that's benefited lots of species. We also see from the movements of crow is that for many shorebird and waterbird species, the Hunter Estuary is very important when there's inland drought. So they come here as a refuge. And then we've got this question mark about Fullerton Cove, and it is contaminated. Is that having an effect on shorebirds? There really needs to be some studies about the chronic toxicity of those chemicals and a clean-up plan. But seeing as they can't clean it up for landowners, they're probably not too much for shorebirds. And then I guess 3 sort of good news comments really. So what I've talked about tonight, and the analysis that Aaron and I have done, it's a team effort. There's more than 200 people that have helped with the surveys, and there's lots of people that have done it for lots and lots of years. The other important thing is that we work very closely with the local land managers, National Parks and Wildlife Service. I think Joe Erskine's online tonight listening. Hunter Local Land Services, NCIG for their bits of the estuaries as well. And yeah, so I think it's the fact that HBOC is able to work with these groups, I think it's been to everybody's benefit. And I guess the final point here is, so all of our data goes into bird data, and so it's in a national database, and it's used for those national kind of analyses and things, and that's very important. But there's nobody in Melbourne who's going to ever sit down and analyse data for the Hunter, for any part of the Hunter, and come up with so all of the other surveys that we do, the Swansea, the Swan Bay, all those things, at some point somebody really needs to sit down and have a look at it, because that's the only way we're going to find out what's actually happening. So to conclude, we need to think about some of the blessings that we have. The Hunter Estuary is just a fantastic asset right on our doorstep with all these wonderful birds. A large amount of it is protected. It's within the Hunter Wetlands National Park, and so that just makes it so much easier to manage. And much of the estuary is in fact proactively managed. So if you look at firstly those rehabilitation projects, and then there's also the restoration work on the dikes, which were fallen to pieces and they are being progressively restored. There's mangrove control measures, there's fox baiting programs. There's lots of really good things that are happening in the estuary that help keep it so great for us with our interest in birds. Okay, so it really is time to celebrate. Back to the old title. And a special thanks to all the people, past and present, who've helped over what's now 23 years of surveys. Thank you.